Welcome, everybody. I am Ben Welle from World Resources Institute. I'm Director of Integrated Transport and Innovation. You are all in this session, Informal Transport and Bus Reforms in the Post-COVID World. Our session objective today is to discuss the factors and steps for improving informal and semi-formal public transport in terms of riders, operators, workers, that leads to more sustainable and safe transport, helping reduce and keep transport carbon emissions low, increasing safety and security, and improving air quality and access to opportunity, and allowing people to thrive in their cities. We are largely speaking, if you're in case, what is informal transport? Well, the term itself is kind of controversial, and we'll talk about that. But what we're talking about are the minibuses and the microbuses that carry in many cities the vast majority of public transport riders. These range from the matatus of Nairobi, the trotros of Accra, the micros of Mexico City, and the jeepneys of Manila, and many other names for these services. In Africa, for example, up to 90% of surface public transport is often provided through what is often called in Africa the paratransit systems. As I allude to calling it paratransit, the term informal itself tends to suggest a sort of marginalization. And in fact, these services have been marginalized in policy and planning. Yet they do provide crucial services to people, and in many ways, good service. They provide a high level of access to jobs and other opportunities. We did a report in Nairobi that showed, in fact, the Matatu network basically meets the goal of providing the sustainable development goal of public transport within half kilometer of regular service to people. They also have some downsides: labor concerns for workers, security issues, price gouging in terms of weather events, and so forth. But investments into BRT, bus rapid transit, and other rapid transit systems have not addressed the wider integration and improvement of these minibus networks. In the last month, WRI actually released a paper with the Inter-American Development Bank on informal and semi-formal transport in Latin America. And we found that the modernization efforts by many cities in recent decades have produced mixed outcomes, often not integrating and not impacting the quality and services of the minibus systems. So improving access for more residents means investing into these popular transit systems, which I say popular because that's another term used for the services. And it also means having better governance around public transport in cities. WRI also hosts what we call Digital Transport for Africa.org. This is an effort to map out minibus networks in African cities, and we do this with a number of partners, and want to thank the French Development Agency for supporting that work. There's a similar effort called Datum in Latin America, and this is not just about mapping these public transport networks, but basically establishing them and acknowledging them so that we can go beyond mapping to planning and improving these networks for people. So I'm not going to talk too much here. I'm here to moderate. Today we are being pushed by a growing cadre of researchers, experts, city officials experimenting and working on these issues to more widely acknowledge these popular transit systems as assets to cities that provide access, that provide services, and how we can both plan and integrate and earnestly address some of the issues that are at hand with these networks. And so we're going to hear from a variety of different viewpoints, here from multilateral development banks to global thought leaders and issue leaders to the city officials that are working in cities like Lima and Cape Town on improving these networks. So I want to welcome our panel to this session and want to thank everyone again for joining this. I'm going to kind of kick things off and go right into the discussion. Our panelists' bios are all in the session posting on the Hop-In website. So if you want to read the detailed bios of those folks, of everyone here, just please do that. But I'm going to ask each panelist to just briefly introduce themselves when I ask the first question. I'm going to start this off by turning to George Darido. He is a lead urban transport specialist at the World Bank. And George, let's just kick things off here by saying, you know, what's the World Bank thinking on this? We've had, of course, investments in BRT, Metro, yet these systems are largely not being really integrated or addressed. And I wonder what kind of thinking the World Bank, where you're at least in this terms of the global dialogue on this topic. So George, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And thanks for the invitation to join this panel. I think I want to first echo what you said here. I mean, I think informal is maybe a poor choice of words for a whole sector that we're trying to describe here. The problem is we don't have a good word. You know, it tends to be a self-organized, but range of formality, and it can, and also sometimes referred to as intermediate public transport or paratransit in some countries. And I think it's important to try to describe this well, but it's a very it's a large subsector that I think we're all trying to understand. The second point I want to make is that I do want to clarify, perhaps there's a wrong impression of the projects of the World Bank and maybe some other development banks in the past. I think the objective of any mass transit investment was not to replace the, let's call it, informal or semi-formal public transport system. I think the idea is always to try to incorporate them and integrate them into whatever is the mass transit system or the public transport system that's being designed. And of course, the challenge is how to do it. And it's not that easy, but it starts with stakeholder engagement. And I think this is the thing that we are emphasizing here at the World Bank. And integration, there are many different levels of integration. So it's not just physical integration, but fair integration and thinking about operational integration. And what do I mean by that? Thinking about, well, is it possible to concession out some of these services so that they become really an integral part of the system? No, maybe as a feeder, maybe as something else. But as you said, I mean, they tend to be microbuses, smaller buses, and there's a big need also, very important in the strategy, to help them improve their services. So I mean, not just in terms of safety and quality, but to modernize them with technology. Many of them are already very entrepreneurial, and they do this already, you know, through cashless payment, for example. And I think that there's still opportunities to spread this kind of experience and make it and make that improve their services that way as well. And then as a last resort, I think there's too much emphasis on regulation, but regulation is sometimes important for safety reasons, for other important reasons. And you may have to take some vehicles out of circulation, but we have to always keep in mind that these are people's livelihoods. And as you said, Ben, this is a critical service for many people to get to work, to get to services. It sometimes is the best option available. So you can't take away something without providing something better. So what are we doing in the World Bank? I mean, we are together with partners. We are trying to study these different systems. We're trying to develop a strategy and trying to implement the strategy when we develop investment projects such as BRTs or metros, to do the work and the reforms ahead of time or in parallel with the development of these projects. Because too often, I think we see some cautionary tales of trying to implement a BRT without having done the reforms and the stakeholder engagement and the improvements that are needed to the existing or the incumbent public transport system, and then there creates conflicts. So we're working on some guidance notes together with SSATP, the Sub-Saharan Africa Transport Program. We have the support of some donors, and hopefully also working together with the other panelists here so that we can develop a consensus around what is the strategy to integrate, improve, and these systems into a better public transport system. Because I think we can all agree that, particularly in light of COVID and this pandemic that we're seeing, public transport will have to improve, and buses in particular will have to modernize. And so I think I see a merging of the agendas. I mean, the modernizing bus systems needs to happen. It's happening in a few places, and here we're talking about not just thinking in terms of technology, but how to make operations more efficient so that we can ensure that their financial sustainability. And so I think it's very important to think more holistically about the system of bus services together with the informal, semi-formal, and try to come together to provide a clean, safe, affordable, accessible service to users. So keeping the users really ultimately in mind. And with that, I think COVID presents a number of challenges, perhaps some opportunities. We're trying to explore that as well, because I think when we talk about reforms, and in some countries, there's talk of also trying to stabilize the sector, because as I said, it's an important sector for the livelihood for many people, or an essential service for many people. What kind of reforms can be introduced together with any kind of financial assistance or other technical assistance to modernize this sector?
Thank you, George. Why don't I turn to Benjamin de la Peña? Benji, you're from the Shared Use Mobility Center. You lead that group, but you're also leading this creation of the Global Partnership for Informal Transport, partly because you're saying that these are in fact assets. I wonder if you could talk about the partnership, why you're launching it, and what you're trying to accomplish with that.
Thanks, Ben. So we formed the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation in November of last year. So we're very young. We're under just a little over 3 months. And we formed it with New Cities in Montreal, Agile City Partners, and CoMotion. And the reason we formed it is exactly what we're talking about, right? That informal transportation, and we don't even have a real name for it. When India likes to call it intermediate public transportation, but it's not clear what's it intermediate to. I tried makeshift mobility, no one picks that up. Or pop transit is another thing that's there, but it's a global phenomenon. And that's what we're trying to elevate, that this happens everywhere and it's emergent. And I think the thing that's also layering on it is that technology is coming on board, both with the mapping, but also with the ride hail and payment services. And that system is merging, and very, very much so for governments and for technical assistance agencies and for the development banks. We don't understand the system because we come from very structured understanding of what a transportation system is supposed to be. In fact, as we're talking about it, we say buses, right? But informal transportation systems are not buses, just buses, right? You've got the three-wheelers, like the auto rickshaws and the tuk-tuks, and not just in India, but in Egypt and the Middle East, and also in West Africa, and also in Latin America. And you've got the two-wheelers, the Okadas and the Ojeks of the world, and the Bodas. And they serve, like you said, massive populations, and billions of people literally served, and employing millions of people. And so the Global Partnership wants to elevate that sector and understand it with a different lens, because these are self-organizing systems. There is regulation that goes on, but it proceeds from an exclusionary, you're a traffic problem, and we will regulate you as a traffic problem, or you are businesses, and so we will regulate you as micro businesses. And the only layer that's more oriented towards people is about the fares and the controlling of the fares. And then the business models are the same. It's like vehicle rent, and then the driver earns whatever's on top of the vehicle rent. And so it's a global phenomena, and we need to understand it as a global phenomena. We need to understand its role of serving the cities, not just for people, but also for goods. And we need to understand how are we going to decarbonize this sector, right? So a lot of the climate funders are starting to talking about electrifying systems, but are thinking just in vehicles and buses and not the systems themselves. And then you've got the technology side, where you have companies like Gojek, that is now a decacorn valued at $10 billion, right? Or Grab. And they're growing very fast on top of these transportation systems. Meanwhile, governments are still trying to get a handle of what they are. And reacting to what George just did, I think in a way he's right. The World Bank in their programs don't intend to remove informal transportation, but locally, they're always framed as problems. And the imagination of most national local leaders is, once we build that BRT, the collectivos are going to all disappear and wither away. And they don't, because they serve people. So going back to the global partnership, we want to help understand the emergent forces, think about new business models and new institutional models, because these are distributed systems. And the way we've been handling them is trying to impose institutional, I would say, industrial style, top-down hierarchies on distributed systems, and that's not going to work. And I think what we need to experiment on is funding. So I was in a conference 2 months or so ago with another development bank and a very large engineering firm, and they were talking about how do we make our transportation systems resilient and climate resistant. And all of the conversations were on large transportation infrastructure that were yet to be built and will probably take 10 years or so to build and plan. At best, there were BRT systems they were talking about. No one was mentioning auto rickshaws and jeepneys and matatus and marshrutskas in Eastern Europe and dollar vans in New York City, which are all part of this kind of emergent system. And these systems are already resilient because they emerge from the bottom and are probably going to be much more easier to both decarbonize and climate proof than the big expensive projects that most countries and cities ask for, that the development banks fund. So part of our job in the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation, and I put in a link in the chat for those who are interested, is to say, how do we rethink about this? How do we redirect resources to the systems that people already use, and not as an afterthought of, we're going to put in a BRT, we need to integrate the buses and the auto rickshaws.
Yeah, I mean, excellent points, Benji. And, that's a great global perspective. I actually heard Gershwin kind of to something you were saying. So let's turn to some city perspectives. Let's first go to Gershwin, and then we'll go to Maria Jara. And thanks, Maria, for joining us. Gershwin, you're Director of Public Transport in Cape Town. Why don't you tell us a bit about what you're doing with some of these issues that you've talked about?
Good morning.
Why don't Gershwin, I will go to you first. Maria, then I'll go to you second.
Sorry, my mic's on mute. Ben, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for the invite and this great topic. I think I'm extremely excited that we can talk about informal transport at this stage, and I think the topic is teed up wonderfully. So I've had a great opportunity since 2007 to be involved in the planning and the design, the implementation and now the operation of our first BRT project in Cape Town. And like other cities in South America, in South Africa, we use BRT to transform, in inverted commas, the informal transport. The idea was to bring the informal transport into the formal market, and they would be the operators of BRT. 2020, 10 years later, we're running a successful BRT system, but the critical lessons learned was that our assumptions around informal transport was technically and financially flawed. So we've had 10 years of lessons learned, but it's good lessons learned. And the whole thing about transforming the industry is a fantasy. So in terms of what hasn't worked in our system was that a scheduled service cannot respond to all of the needs and all of the passenger needs. It's impossible. And in our cities, when you talk about informal transport, they respond to the bespoke needs of passengers, both peak and off-peak. And they've got this wonderful ability in the first trip in the morning and the last trip in the evening to drop people at home closer because of safety and security measures. In a very rigid, scheduled BRT system, obviously we could not do that. We had a rule that we needed to serve 500 meters to people's residence. So we removed informal transport, we put in a scheduled service. But over time, because of people's needs, you saw taxis coming back into the network because they responded to a specific need. Financially, it didn't work because your scheduled feeders are very expensive to operate both peak and off-peak because they mix traffic, they're small. In the off-peak, the demand is not that high, so your buses are empty. Where the informal transport, they are perfectly, in terms of their model, to respond to that need. So I've always said, informal transport for me is 3 words that summarize. They're agile, they're responsive, and they're resilient. And that's the critical lessons we've learned. So what have we done? So we ran an exciting pilot project in the city of Cape Town, where we're trying to see how can we incorporate the informal transport into our model. So we've done a pilot project over the last 2 years where we identified a small area in our big suburb where there was 78, let's say 78 operating licenses of minibus taxis. And what we did, we pooled the operating licenses and vehicles together to create an operating company, but we didn't run into the company formation. We first wanted the operators to see the benefits of operating in a collective environment. And when those benefits revealed itself, the operators themselves are knocking on the door to go to the next step to develop these companies. So we have seen wonderful results in this project. The collective approach, for example, provided the following benefits. There was a reduction in fuel consumption by 45%. So it's not just individual owners going to a specific fuel company, but collectively you have an opportunity to get a reduced price. Fuel, tire maintenance cost discounts. We had an improvement of reliability and overall quality offering. And from that 78 operators before, post, they only needed about 40 vehicles to operate a level of, or a frequent level of service now than what's before. So that obviously had an impact on drivers. There was a reduction of average driver workday. So we have seen a successful result out of our pilot project. We now want to get into the next phase where we want to formulate the company and then seek more funding to take it to the next level. Finally, a chairperson, the other opportunities, and we always talk about financial sustainability. And then because we don't subsidize the taxis, we then kill the project. But there are other opportunities for funding that we are exploring. For example, I'm not quite sure what's it called in other cities, but we have public transport interchanges where all these taxis come together, and it's a huge area where taxis come together, people come together, and that facility has an opportunity for additional source of revenue for the taxi industry. For example, as government, we spend a lot of money to clean that facility, to manage the tenants, to provide light maintenance. But now, as a company of the taxis, once they formulated, they can own that PTI, and we then can enter into contracts for them to clean, for them to manage the advertising, for them to manage the tenants, for them to do the light maintenance, to have additional sources of income. In addition to that, in conclusion, Chair, is that we've also, our provincial government has done a wonderful job during COVID, where they've been using paratransit to transport health workers and taking people to quarantine sites, which has shown us that paratransit and informal transport is not just for commuter travel. They can be used for other trip purposes, which we can then implement in the model. So we're really excited in our pilot project, and we can't wait to move forward and share our experiences. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gershwin. Maria Jara, you are director of the Metropolitan Urban Transport Authority of Lima, one of the largest cities in the Americas, a transport system that is massive on any scale. You've been doing some interesting work around the informal transport in your metropolitan region. Do you want to give us some insights as to what you're doing and some lessons?
Thank you very much for inviting me to come here. The Metropolitan Urban Transport Authority in Lima is a rather new institution that has the competencies that were previously held by a number of other institutions. And I'm saying this because since September 2018, this new authority was created and began to take its first steps. In November 2019, it received its first funding to be able to work. A few days before, this organization began to handle all the different conventional types of transport. And it was only in September 2020 when it also integrated all transport services in Lima, the metro service, metropolitan services, and all complementary corridors. I mentioned this timeline because I think it is important to highlight that while we were working in the actual constitution of the organization, obviously 3 months before the first steps were taken, we were surprised by COVID, and the pandemic basically questioned the importance of going for public transport and suggested going for a more sustainable option instead. In the case of Lima or Callao, we cannot have this both options, and I want to manifest this in these terms because our transport system is deeply informal in its nature. As part of our task, we need to consolidate it and give it enough quality for the enjoyment of users, and especially people who live in the periphery. And here we're talking about 11 million people that use the urban public transport in Lima and Callao. We support them in 80% of their transport moves. So it is absolutely key that transport systems are accessible for these people in a financial perspective, but also from the point of view of transport modes. So what is the situation we're currently facing? We tried a commission-based system. The formal system in Lima and Callao basically only refers to 10% of public transport moves, and this is something that we should take into account. We basically share of transport companies, a number of transport companies which are basically operators that do not have institutional strength And for our organization, the ATU, this implies a great challenge, especially in COVID times. We have characterized the different transport systems as public goods, and we also have a national transport policy that in reality constitutes a totally referential norm. And what do I mean by this? Well, the various public management policies were not developed to allow us to assist and help transport companies. And the experience of Lima and Callao has been pioneer, and it is important for us because we have laid the foundations for a subsidy that may cover part of the operational costs of transport companies, which are formal in a way because they do have a license, but in practice they have a multiplicity of actors who are the owners of the vehicles themselves, and there is, in a word, there wasn't an operation system around GPS. Say, for example, the GPS is now a pre-requirement that has been fixed, that allows companies to be a part of this system. This technological factor is essential for our authority because it allows us to gather data about routes and fulfillment of rules. It basically also allows us to make sure the healthy protocols complied with, and consequently it ensures that citizens are not affected. In Lima and Callao, we have seen the parallelization of transport systems for periods of 2-3 days, and our authority has had to create alternative services, taking into account that there's different clauses. We've had to establish a methodology to decide compensations. But I want to mention this here because all these efforts to formalize and generate a continuity in the system has to be accompanied by actions on the central government. The ATU, the organization I lead, has a very large mandate, but every 2 months it has to ask the national government for extra funds to be able to work. And yes, as I said, every 2-3 months we need to ask for extra budget to be able to compensate and basically generate the possibilities of helping all those people that need to use public transport to do their essential work activities. So obviously, public transport within this context, is extremely vulnerable. It is complicated to think that we might be able to generate an intense current of change within the services when we are basically facing the number of risks that we're all aware of.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
No, really great insights, Maria Jara. We hope to hear more, and if you some of these really interesting things about the GPS services and collecting data on systems, actually getting to know how they work and what they do, I think is super interesting. Let me turn to Alana. Dave, you're with the International Transport Workers Federation. You have been doing some interesting research and work with workers on informal transport, and I wonder if you could talk about some of the key lessons and opportunities maybe for improving labor and how these may even result in improving services.
Thanks, Ben, and I'd love to contribute what we're learning from our work. We're having this conference in the midst of a pandemic, which has impacted very harshly on the most vulnerable in the workforce, including informal public transport workers who have no access to any social or income protection. They're almost on a daily basis faced with the impossible choice of doing their job and risking their health or losing their income. And, I think this vulnerability to the impacts of COVID isn't an accident. It is severe precisely because of the lack of protection for the informal transport workforce. So what we see now, and we see it very much in our work, what's happening with COVID is that existing inequalities are being further deepened and entrenched, including gender inequality in the informal workforce. Yet, ironically, COVID has highlighted, and a number of you have already spoken about this, that these services are absolutely vital to the ability of cities to respond to the crisis. So I think if the recovery from COVID-19 is going to be meaningful, there has to be a commitment to the improvement of labor conditions, including addressing issues of gender equality as part of the process of reform and formalization of public transport systems worldwide. So just from our point of view, some of the ideas that we've been exploring and that I would like to share, and some of the principles, I think it's really important that there is recognition of the socio-economic differentiation within the informal transport workforce. Owners and workers are distinct groups. And really the reason why I emphasize that is that we know in many cities, in many countries, governments are consulting and talking to organizations of the owners or the operators. But what we know from our work and our own research, that the majority of the informal transport workforce are not working with capital that they own for their job, and neither do they necessarily have an entrepreneurial agenda. So owners and workers have distinct interests and potentially divergent interests. And I think that's really important for us to recognize that, because I want to come back to the issue of stakeholder engagement that George mentioned. And when I talk about workers, I'm also not just referring to the drivers, which is another common mistake. I think we need to recognize that in the informal transport workforce, there are a wide range of different occupations. From our research in Dakar, we identified more than 20 different occupations in the informal transport economy. So really, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, and that's something that ITF is fully behind, we would strongly recommend that there is consultation with representative organizations of the transport workforce. They know the industry best. They have the skills and knowledge. So for example, if you look at the issue of cashless payments, which has emerged much more widely now as part of the response to COVID, the workers very quickly will be able to tell you what they see as the opportunities, but also what they see as the risks of the introduction of new technology. I just want to highlight, very recently we launched a labor impact assessment report, which was commissioned by the ITF, but done by the university and in Dakar and the Global Labor Institute to look at what impacts the new BRT system might have on informal public transport workers. And what was really amazing through that research, through surveys, through interviews for focus groups, the incredible, insightful, and rich proposals that workers have about how to improve their conditions, how to make the public transport system more efficient and how to reduce congestion. And in the case of Dakar, SETUD, which is the transport authority in the city, has shown an in-principle willingness to negotiate and work with the trade unions. So really what I'm trying to kind of highlight here, that I think, other occupation groups in the workforce have unique knowledge. They really know the market structure of paratransit. They know who pays who to do what, who plans the routes, who controls the terminals. So what I would say that really, and we're very keen to play this role, that transport workers should be viewed as an asset whose knowledge can be mobilized to support and shape the reform process and formalization process. Just very quickly, Benjamin, you said that often the decision makers don't know much about these complex systems, and I completely understand that. How will they know how many workers are involved, where women are concentrated, what their skills are, what all the different employment relationships are? But if you want to reform a system, those are exactly the kind of details that we really do need to understand. And those are the kind of ideas that workers could bring to the conversation because they have that detailed knowledge. I would also say that embedded in all of this, with, some of you have spoken about BRT, and I think there's been some interesting Gershwin experiments with this in South Africa. We have to have labor impact assessments. Up until now, we are not aware of any serious attempt to assess the employment implications of these new systems, either positively in terms of the number of new jobs that they're going to create, or negatively, where there might be a detrimental impact on the informal public transport workforce. So our own research has showed us in Dakar potentially job losses of 5,000 to 10,000 workers, in Nairobi about 30,000. So it's really important that if we want to have stakeholder engagement, that we recognize who might be the winners and losers and address those kind of issues in a consultative way.
And excellent points. I mean, I've often seen and witnessed and also heard about, these systems are actually cultures in and of themselves. We talk about Nairobi, the Matatu culture. There's whole art, beautiful pieces of artwork that people do on these systems. Generations of people, families working in these industries. Benji, I know that we've talked about BRT and the need to better integrate BRT, but there's also the issue, and that is a need. I wonder too, though, about the system-wide issues that, some have begun to talk about. Folks at University of Cape Town have covered some of the incremental reforms that can be done, but what should we be considering just part and parcel of BRT, but more to the earnest planning of minibus systems in general and acknowledging them as assets? I wonder if you could, and also I must say, we're in now a kind of rapid response mode because we're only having 15 minutes left.
Well, one of the things I learned from Slum Dwellers International is the first step to inclusion is to be counted. And I agree with Alana, we don't have counts. We don't have clear counts of the number of vehicles, their routes, everything is usually on paper. And so the first thing we need to do is really understand and map these systems. And when we started digital matatus nearly a decade ago, that was the idea. What does this system look like? And even the city didn't understand it until the map was created. Some interesting things happening in Metro Manila in the Philippines. They're moving to a service contracting model, which is exactly picked up from BRT, except on an atomized basis. So that the government pays the jeepney operator and the bus operator to serve kilometers, and you're disconnecting fare from passenger. But you need an coordinating system, not a control system, but an organizing system. And that's where digital technology comes in. And they've hired Sakai.ph, which is an app and mapping provider, to coordinate the system. So there are new approaches that are like that. And again, we need to embrace the systems and fully understand it. And it's a creature of culture and art, exactly as what you're saying, matatu art, jeepney art, Pakistani truck art. And unless government usually comes in and say, you're all going to be painted yellow, which is what happened in Nigeria and all of that. But we need to celebrate that and yet find a way to help them improve the self-organization.
And I know some of the in the chat have mentioned, and we mentioned this in the opening, the issues of governance. Maria Jara, you mentioned the MTA, the Metropolitan Transport Authority, is a fairly new organization. Can you comment on the importance of having a better governance system in place to allow you to, in fact, work more on the informal transport sector?
Yes. Well, for us, the fact that what we do is understood by the different authorities, also the Ministry of Finance, etc. They need to know what the nature of public transport is. We need to daily face this understanding. We need people to know that systems need to be financially sustainable, and it's often hard to make people understand the need for subsidies or aids. For example, also different software that are often aimed at companies that have a number of staff. For the software often do not serve the transport system. The transport system in Peru is led by companies that often do not have formal transport system as such. So the first thing we need to generate as such is a correct approach that is not only academic as such, but also an approach that is more realistic to what the nature of our sector is. We want to make it more professional. For example, we want to professionalize drivers of the public transport system, and these competencies lie in different sectors, not only in our Ministry of Transport and Communications, but there should be an approach that also affects the Ministry of Production, the Ministry of Labor, and the different districts, in such a way that we can all jointly work towards the generation of a system that helps battle an informality within the Peruvian transport system that might be able to also stop creating losses for public transport systems. We believe that the demand of public transport might have fallen around 63%. So the repercussions have been huge within the sector. There is a lot of discontent and uncertainty within the sector that might have an echo in political agendas, and consequently they could also distortion the way people and the way operators see the sector and see the subsidies that we are managing, and that should be given. At the same time, we promote the modernization of public transport systems. We have a zero emissions policy, for example, and so all the services that we create for the following months and years have to be accompanied, of course, by the private sector. And for that to happen, all the authorities need to accompany them with for the development of business.
Thank you, Maria Jara. Great to see the progress you're making with the MTA. Gershwin Fortune, I want to turn to you quick. Have you worked with, I understand there's some data and analytics you've been doing regarding the minibus sector. Have you worked with, private sector entrepreneurs, startups, say, that can help you make informed decisions using better data on your public transport systems in Cape Town?
Yeah. So in this pilot project, definitely, as part of the team, there was a service provider in terms of using the better data, and that's helped us improve the efficiency on the system. If you recall, I said earlier that as opposed to using 78 fleet, we're using 40 with the same level of service, and that's purely because of the data, understanding where passengers are, understanding the tracking and all of those things. So definitely, that is definitely opened up. But I always say, more than the technology aspect, we just must get the fundamentals right so the technology can enable. And let's not jump to the technology first, but so the technology enables the environment. So we've seen that, and it's great. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, definitely.
Okay, great. I mean, reminder that these are systems, right? There's lots of different things going on, governance, data, workers issues, and so forth. Actually, I might turn to Alana Dave on that issue of, if you want to there was a question about mobility as a service, actually. One, component, I guess, of that is sort of a cashless payment system. These have been tried in Nairobi, other places that to really no avail. And, I wonder if you want to talk about the specific link between labor issues and, say, service improvements, because if you want to introduce cashless, you kind of have to take the incentivized out of pocketing, maximizing the take-home pay for drivers and touts. So I'm not sure if I'm hitting on the right nail here, but I wonder if you could talk about that real quick before we turn to George for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail absolutely on the head, Ben, that there is a link between quality work and quality services. And generally, as an international labor organization, including with our affiliates, that we recognize that current informal public transport services are unsustainable. Workers are living with that reality every day. But our research has shown that they are acutely aware of what the service delivery problems are, with overcrowding, congestion, conditions of the vehicles, because it has a very direct impact on passenger revenue and behavior. So they feel that impact. But, in the industry, it's driven by what's called a target system, where the driver has to pay a daily or weekly fee to the owner. Most of the time, that fee can be incredibly high. And that is the cause of, long hours, aggressive driving, accidents, as well as poor service delivery. So we absolutely feel that any kind of reform of the industry, in order to improve service, which is always where the emphasis is, has to change the target system, and employment has to be replaced with formal contracts and regular wages and hours. And by that, you are fundamentally improving labor conditions, but at the same time, there will be a very direct impact on service delivery. I think we need to see decent work as part of the social investment, or part of the social impact of investment in public transport, and changing labor conditions is absolutely fundamental to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a complex issue. And, I think I'm beckoning back to our first plenary on climate, actually, where Mayor Yvonne Aki Sawyer from Freetown talked about the need to listen to people. I I've also heard, if some say, well, what would we do if you had one thing to do about the paratransit industry? And that would be go talk to the operators, go talk to the drivers. George, can you comment on, how can this be better done? I mean, you are doing some stakeholder outreach, but there's sort of, there's that around the BRT, and I know in the chat here we've talked about, there was some mention of, like, has there been something done around Metro, and not just BRT, but Metro, or LRT in the case of Otis, or lack of that, and maybe that's more in the physical planning. But I'm kind of asking a lot here, but maybe you can just comment on sort of the stakeholder engagement and sort of where things are going in that direction for the World Bank in terms of a wider understanding of outreach and with the communities.
Sure, Ben. Yeah, it's a big question here, and I'm also trying to reflect on all the great comments by the panelists. I think that part of the problem here is that there are many levels to what we're talking about here. I mean, in some places, just convincing government that public transport is an essential public good is a challenge. Okay, and then if you work your way down, there are many other levels there. I mean, there are the issues of labor and livelihood. Alana, Benji are mentioning. There's the issue of integration and having some form of, which was a tremendous accomplishment. So congratulations to Maria Jara and everyone in Lima and Callao who created this authority to be able to look at the entire transport system at the metropolitan level. I mean, and then you have also these issues of technical issues to try to make these systems work together. Technology usually is not the limiting factor. It's usually the easiest thing to work on. So it is an issue of business models that Benji talked about. It's an issue of experimentation, like Gershwin talks about, because it's such a diverse subsector. In every place, the solution is going to look a little different. And so I think, at least from the World Bank side, we recognize that there isn't a one-size-fit-all transport solution. I'm talking here public transport, or more broadly here, thinking about, there are comments about mobility as a service. I would also agree. I mean, mobility should always be a service to the user. I think we're talking here about how can we make improvements and actually make a difference in a particular city. And the solution is going to look a little different in each place. Maybe it's a little more on the technology in some place. Maybe it's more on the financing in others, because there's an issue of access to finance to be able to modernize systems there. Maybe it's more of an institutional issue and creating some sort of governance. And so I think that this is part of the challenge, trying to really think about a strategy, and all the different levels requires a lot of upfront work. It does, I think, require some form of strategy and thinking about integrating all these three pieces: the technical, the institutional, and the financial.
Great thoughts to end with, George. So we're actually about a minute out. I'm just going to end with kind of summarizing. We've talked about sort of the governance issues, need for improving institutional capacity. We've heard from Gershwin Fortune about some of the improvements they've done in Cape Town after the introduction of BRT and some of the lessons learned. Really super interesting info. I hope people look into that more. Benji, you've introduced the Global Partnership for Informal Transport. Please, everyone, go visit the partnership's website. Georges mentioned a paper that's going to be, or some work coming out from SSATP on this topic in Africa. And Alana mentioned and linked to some reports from ITF on this subject. I also mentioned some at the beginning. There's a lot to do here. There's a lot of research out there, a lot of learning. We can't cover that in an hour for sure. But I want to thank all of the participants here who are really leading on these issues and thoughts around the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining Transforming Transportation and this panel. And I hope everyone has a great evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are at.